Hello everyone, and welcome back to another cartography lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to build off our discussion last time about scale into something that is related but still distinct, and that's this idea of data resolution. So we left off last time talking about this idea of large scale versus small scale, and the way that the meaning of those terms changed depending on whether you were talking about scale from the geographic perspective or the cartographic perspective. And what I want to do is I want to take that concept and I want to build into this idea of data resolution. So data resolution is essentially talking about the size of the smallest unit of measurement in your map. That's why you'll often sometimes see data resolution also referred to as the minimum mapping unit. Right. Data resolution or minimum mapping unit. And you can think of this as basically a measure of what's the smallest thing you're trying to map. Or conversely, another way we can think of data resolution is the scale at which your data is collected, right? These are sort of two perspectives you can use to think about this idea of data resolution. And so if we're coming at this from a raster data structure perspective, right, if we're coming at this from a raster data structure perspective, we're basically talking about this idea of cell size, or spatial resolution. Right. And so if you're not familiar with the raster data structure, or you maybe need a refresher, basically the raster data structure boils down to this idea of a pixel, which is basically just a square. And this square represents some area on the Earth's surface. Typically, you could think of this as being maybe imagery, so this would be, what the Earth's surface looks like color-wise, or it could be a classification such as land cover. But either way, the raster data structure has this idea of cell size or spatial resolution, which is basically just a measure of the length of one side of your pixel. So this length right here, this is going to be your cell size or your data resolution. So some examples of this, we have imagery from something like Planet Labs, which is color imagery that has a spatial resolution of 3 meters, which means the length of this side is 3 meters. You also could have another example, would be something like the National Land Cover data, or NLCD, where the value inside of the pixel represents the land cover type. So things like trees, water, urban development. right, that has a cell size of 30 meters. Right, so the length again of one side of the pixel is 30 meters. So from a raster data structure perspective, this idea of the data resolution is pretty intuitive. But what happens when we move away from the raster data structure and into the vector data structure? So when we're dealing with the vector data structure, typically, even if you're talking about points or polygons, right, you could have points that maybe are the centroid of a polygon or something like that. You typically hear the vector data structure described in terms of either geographic or natural boundaries. Right, so the data resolution is described in terms of either natural, right, natural or political boundaries. Right, natural or political boundaries. And so a couple of really good examples of this. Right, some examples of this might be, say you were collecting population data, right, for a given area. And you decided that you were going to go to the US Census and you were going to get population values for each block in the area that you were trying to measure, right? So, for example, you could have population data at the block level. Right, population data at the block level. And in this case, right, blocks, right, those are a civil division, so that is a political boundary. Right, conversely, right, another thing you might want to do is maybe you're interested in the environment, and rather than dealing with population data, maybe you wanted to measure what's called carbon sequestration, which is essentially a measure of how much carbon a particular area is able to store. Right? So if it has a high carbon sequestration, it means it's pulling carbon out. If it has a low carbon sequestration, that means that it's either emitting more carbon, or maybe it's not necessarily interacting in the carbon cycle at all. And so an example of that might be, you might have carbon sequestration data, right, at the watershed level. Right, at the watershed level. And in this case, right, watershed, right, this is going to be a natural boundary. Right, so in this case, we're talking about a political boundary, and in this case, we're talking about a natural boundary. And I think it's really important to consider this idea of the data resolution or the minimum mapping unit when we're talking about scale, because just like we said in the previous videos, right, scale is really going to determine sort of the level of detail that you need. And in the same way, your minimum mapping unit or your data resolution is going to drive that same process, right? Because you want to make sure that your data resolution matches your scale. And what I mean by that is, you could imagine that you have this first example here of talking about population data at the block level, right? But if you were to make a map at the country level, right, so a large geographic scale, right, the entire United States, you could imagine how the block group level political boundaries might be too fine, right? You'd have way too many mapping units, and it might make the overall map hard to read. So you might want to then rethink your data resolution, right? Maybe you want to pick a state or a county instead and keep the blocks, or maybe you want to aggregate your data to maybe the county level or the state level. Okay, so hopefully that concept makes sense, that relationship between the scale that you're planning to map at and the data resolution that you have, and realizing that you might need to adjust one or the other to make them sort of have a nice balance. So hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully this idea of data resolution makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.